Hello, third graders. So for the book Poppy for CIA, each video is going to be its own chapter. So if we look at the beginning of the book, we'll see how many different lessons you'll be watching throughout the first 6 weeks of school. So there's 20 chapters, so you can expect 20 different videos. And then within that video, I'll make sure to include the vocabulary that goes with the curriculum. So last week, if you were here, we did subjects versus king, referring to Mr. Ocox as having Poppy and Ragweed as his subjects. And then we also looked at hero versus villain. So for the first two vocab words or pages that we did, you talk about what subjects are, some more synonyms, and we had 3. We thought of 3 different words to record. And then for king, we thought of 3 other words that are synonyms or words that associate your thinking with king, and same with hero versus villain. For the rest are just single vocabulary words. Okay, except for that one. So the first word that we're gonna do for today is consequences. So every vocab page, it tells you where it was in the story. Sometimes the actual word is not in the book. Sometimes it's inferred. Inferred means that there's clues that tell us the meaning of that word, but it's actually not in the text. So the first word we'll look for is consequences, and if you look, it's going to be on page 3. Any of the vocabulary words that we look at are going to be highlighted in the book. And we'll pause and we'll just make sure that you know what those words mean. I'm going to reread the blurb quickly. So the blurb tells us a little bit of background information. In this case, it tells us some of the characters and where the story takes place. At the very edge of Dimwood Forest stands an old charred oak. A great horned owl, Mr. Ocox, waits there. With his piercing gaze, he surveys the land he calls his own, watching for creatures he considers his subjects. None dares to disobey him, until the night a courageous deer mouse named Poppy boldly defies him, only to find herself in terrible danger. To lead her family to a better life, will Poppy battle Mr. Ocox to the end. And we're going to look closely at this in school so we understand where things are happening. Chapter 1. I'm going to use this so you guys can follow along. Chapter 1, Mr. Ocox. A thin crescent moon, high in the sky, shed faint white light over Dimwood Forest. Stars glowed. Breezes, full of ripe summer fragrance, floated over nearby meadow and hill. Dimwood itself, veiled in darkness, lay utterly still. At the very edge of this forest stood an old, charred oak, on which sat a great horned owl. The owl's name was Mr. Ocox, and he looked like death himself. Mr. Ocox's eyes, flat upon his face, were round and yellow with large, ebony pupils that enabled him to see as few other creatures could. Moonlight, even faint moonlight, was as good as daylight for him. With his piercing gaze, Mr. Ocox surveyed the land he called his own, watching for the comings and goings of creatures he considered his subjects and his dinners. He looked at Glitter Creek, home to the fish he found so appetizing, the tar road across which tasty rabbits were known to hop, Jay Woods, where meaty chipmunks sometimes skittered before dawn. By swiveling his head, he searched for marsh for savory frogs. then Newfield, where usually he could count on a delicious vole or two. He looked at Grey House, where Farmer Lamont used to live, then upon the old orchard. He even looked nervously towards Newhouse, but nowhere did he see a thing to eat. Profoundly annoyed, Mr. Wilcox was beginning to think he would have no dinner that night. But finally there, near the top of Bannock Hill, where the ponderosa pines had all been cut, where only a few struggling saplings and bushes grew, he saw movement. Just a glimmer of food was enough to cause the owl's heart to pound. His curved beak, black beak, was clack, his feathers horns to stand up tall. Mr. Wilcox shifted his head from right to left, forward and back. When he did so, he beheld 2 mice. Of all the creatures the owl hunted, he enjoyed mice the most. They were the most fearful, the best eating to be sure, and Mr. Wilcox found deep satisfaction in having others afraid of him. And here, after a wait of nearly the whole night, were 2 savory subjects to terrify before he ate them. One of those 2, a deer mouse, crouched cautiously beneath a length of rotten bark. The other, a golden mouse, stood and open on his hind legs, his short tail sticking straight out behind for balance. From his left ear, an earring dangled. In his paws, he held a hazelnut. It's not as if I haven't warned these mice, Mr. Wilcox murmured to himself. If they will move about without my permission, they have only themselves to blame for their consequences. So far we have 2 words: consequences and satisfaction. So hopefully you are thinking about what those 2 words could mean. And then as you are watching this, you can always pause it and complete your vocab packets at that moment. As he leaned forward to listen, his sharp as needles talons, 4 to each large claw and jet black at their tips, cut deeply into the branches he was perched on. Catching these 2 mice is gonna be fun, he mused. And Bannock Hill, the golden mouse, turned to his timid companion and said, "Poppy girl, this hazelnut is bad to the bone. Bet you seed to sap there's more where it came from. Come on out and dig." "Ragweed," Poppy replied, as if she sniffed tensely in all directions. "You promised we'd dance when we got here. We can't do it in the open. Besides, I want to answer your question. So will you please get under here with me?" Ragweed laughed. "Dude, you must think I'm as dull as a dormouse. You just want to get some of this nut." "I don't want any of your precious nut," Poppy insisted. "I want you to give you my answer, and I want to dance. Isn't that the reason we came up the hill? Only it's not safe out there." "Oh, tell me about it." "You heard my father's warnings," Poppy went on. "It's Mr. Wilcox. He might be watching and listening." "Get off. Your pop talks about that Wilcox dude just to scare you and keep you under control," Ragweed sneered. "Ragweed," Poppy cried, "that's ridiculous. Mr. Wilcox does rule Dimwood, so we have to ask his permission to be here. And you know perfectly well we never did." "Dude, I'm not going to spend my whole life asking an old owl if it's okay every time I want to have fun. Know what I'm saying? This is our moment, girl, right? And now that I've dug this nut up, I'm going to enjoy it." "Besides," he said, it's too dark for an old owl to see me." "Poppy," Mr. Wilcox scuffed under his breath. "Ragweed. What stupid names these mice have. Now, if only that deer mouse will move just a little farther out from under cover, I'll be able to snare both mice at once." The mere thought of such a double catch made Mr. Wilcox hiss with pleasure. Then he clacked his beak, spread his wings, and rose into the night air. Up he circled, his fluted feathers, flight feathers, beating the air silently. High above Bannock Hill, he looked down. The golden mouse, the one eating the nut, was still in the open. So brazen, so foolish. Nevertheless, Mr. Wilcox decided to hold back another moment to see if the deer mouse might budge. "Ragweed," Poppy pleaded, "please get under here." "Girl," Ragweed said, "do you know what your problem is? You let your tail lead the way." Poppy, hurt and wanting to show that she was not a coward, poked her nose and whiskers out from under the bark. "Ragweed," she persisted, even as she began to creep into the open. "Being careless is stupid." Her friend took another scrape of the nut and sighed with pleasure. "Poppy, you may be the best girl, but admit it. If you don't know how to live, you don't know how to live like I do." Poppy took 2 more steps behind the bark. Just then, Mr. Wilcox pulled his wings close to his body and plunged. In an instant, he was right above and behind the 2 mice. Once there, he threw out his wings to break his speed, pulled back his head to protect his eyes, and thrust his claws forward and wide like grappling hooks to pounce. It was Poppy who saw him. "Ragweed!" she shrieked in terror as she hurtled herself back under cover. "It's Wilcox!" But the owl was already upon them. Down came his right claw. It snatched the tip of Poppy's nose. Down came his left claw. It was more successful, clamping around Ragweed's head and neck like a vise of needles, killing him instantly. The next moment, the owl soared back into the air. A lifeless ragweed, earring glittering in the moonlight, hung from a claw. As for the hazelnut, it fell to the earth like a cold stone. Powerful, but leisurely, strokes brought Mr. Wilcox back to Watching Tree. Once there, he shifted the dead ragweed from talon to beak in one gulp. The mouse disappeared down his throat, earring and all. His hunger momentarily satisfied, Mr. Wilcox tilted back his head and let forth a long, low cry of triumph. "Woo-hoo!" Poppy did not hear that call. In her terror, she had fainted. Now she lay unconscious beneath the length of rotten bark. The owl did not mind. He had enjoyed the first mouse so much, he decided to wait for a second. Indeed, Mr. Wilcox was not entirely sorry that Poppy had escaped. She was terrified, and he enjoyed that. And for sure, he would get her soon. "Oh yes," he murmured to himself. "Mice are the most fun to catch." Then Mr. Wilcox did that rare thing for an owl. He smiled. That is the end of chapter 1. So 2 words here: consequences and satisfaction. End of chapter 1.